Radio TV phono nut here, and oh, this takes the cake as far as poor packing. FedEx man showed up at the house a few minutes ago, and he said, "Sir, I'd like you to do me a favor. This box is how I got it, and the top of it was all bashed in." And he said, "I'd like for you to check this before I get away from here to make sure it contains the correct content." So I looked at it, and it appears to be okay. But I just thought I thought this would be provide some wow factor for you this afternoon. The box was not taped, all caved in here. Looks like they recycled some packing tape off of something. You open the box here, and this is pretty much what I found. Some old newspaper just stuck in here on top like this, and the record player just thrown in a box. Alright, let's make sure the contents are actually in good shape. Come on out of there. Plane always loves to spy on me every time I get outside to make a YouTube video. Okay, this is a Hamilton school record player. The case looks in pretty good shape, except needing to be cleaned. So let's find out what's under the hood together. Well, it should be no surprise that they didn't tie the tone arm to the wrist. And of course the tip on the 89T cartridge is busted off. Yeah, looks in pretty good shape. Let's put it in neutral and spin the platter and see if it's... Yeah, the platter looks to be pretty even. Alright, I flipped the needle over to the other side, which is supposed to be the 78 side, but this may be one with a dual LP tip. Well, it works. That arm is like so many of these cheap plastic static arms get. They end up getting wobbly, and I may just end up replacing this with a better quality metal tone arm. Usually what I do on these is replace the 89T cartridge with a Barco TN8 cartridge that is more compliant and will work better in these plastic tone arms. Alright, here we are, and here's when it was manufactured, October the 11th, 1996. So this is definitely one of the later model classroom record players to use an AC, the good old style General Industries AC drive mechanism. In fact, I think Hamilton made this model up until 2000, 2001. And even though Hamilton's a cheap brand, I'll have to give them this. They at least stuck with the old style drive motor after everybody else, Califone and Audiotronics, had gone to DC motors. And of course Newcomb was already out of business by the mid-90s. I think they were gone by about early 80s, I'd say. So yeah, we can shame the Goodwill in Zanesville, Ohio for their lousy packing job. Just goes to show you how well these classroom record players are built. They can basically throw them in a box and put no packing in them, and they still arrive intact, but don't get any ideas, because the very one you send like that will wind up arriving smashed to bits, and then it's just going to ruin everybody's day. Here we have a problem. This arm that I robbed off of this Newcomb record player that I'm scrapping out because the motor shaft got bent on it, and the platter is off balance, and there's some other problems that I just deemed it to be more valuable for parts and to fix. But yeah, this tone arm is too long, and the mounting hole on the record player is not large enough. Of course, I could drill a bigger hole, but the tone arm is still too long, so I'm going to try to find something more suitable for this, something better than this little plastic kitty arm. Okay, back on the Hamilton. You might recall in a recent video this Califone record player from 1966. It could be fixed, but it's really not worth fixing. The motor is worn out. There's extensive rust all over the speaker grill. Several other things that it needs. The cabinet is not in good shape. This escutcheon where the knobs are is all skin up and beat up, so it's one of those situations, yes, I could overhaul it, but would it be worth it? It's not like it's an uncommon record player. And by the time I overhauled it and did it properly, I'd have so much time and money invested in it that it wouldn't be really feasible, and I'd just be better off just finding a record player in better shape. And the parts off of this one will go to help 2 or 3 others that are in better shape live, such as this Hamilton right here. We're going to take the tone arm off of this Califone and replace the cheesy plastic tone arm in this Hamilton. Now, of course, we had this other tone arm that's just like it, but this one doesn't use 1/2-inch cartridge mounting, and I need one for 1/2-inch cartridge mounting, so guess where it's going to come from? Off of this Califone. But what I have planned for the Califone is the tone arm is going on the Hamilton. And then we have this other Califone 1450, also from about 65 or 66, same era as this entry-level tube model. This one's solid state. This one is not in the greatest of shape, but it's in a lot better shape than this one down here is. Somebody has messed with the drive mechanism and screwed it up, so I'm going to need some mechanical parts off of this one. Also, this one had one of those foam rubber mats on it that crumbles, and on this Califone, somebody had replaced the platter mat with a nice rubber mat, and they glued it on really well. So rather than try to tear that mat off of this platter, I'm probably just going to go ahead and just swap the platters around since they're the same platter. Also, we're missing some case screws in this Califone, so we have some original case screws out of this junker Califone that will fit in this one, and it'll look original. As you can see, this one is kind of dinged up, but like I said, it's not in nearly as bad a shape as the parts donor. And this one is a early generation solid state model with a hand-wired amplifier. I had one of these years ago, and it sounded really good and had lots of volume for what it is. And then the 5x7 speaker out of the Califone is going into this rarity. This is an American Foundation for the Blind talking book player from, I believe, 1950. This plays 78 and 33 RPM records, but it's not really meant for 33 RPM microgroove records. It was meant for the old wide groove talking book records that I believe were played with a 1.8 mil stylus. Of course, in today's world, that would be a 2 mil stylus that you'd use. I actually did a video on this machine back in 2012, and somebody really butchered it up, and I just never completed it. And over the years, I actually had robbed some parts off of it, the speaker mainly, because I needed it for something else. The original drive mechanism was fouled up, and I ended up trying to fix that and ended up making a mess out of it. Well, I got lucky and found a new old stock General Industries mechanism that was just like what came out of it, so I've already transplanted that mechanism. It's brand new. Of course, it needs to be greased and lubricated because something that's been sitting since the 1950s, you know the lubrication is shot, but at least we know all the metal is in good shape and not worn out from constant use. This tone arm, I'm not sure about it. It's a plastic tone arm, and I don't know that it's original or not, but I'm probably going to replace it with a a metal one that's a little longer. And if you notice, when we move the tone arm towards the spindle, the tracking angle is not quite right. It should overhang the spindle just a little bit, so I'm wondering if maybe this is a replacement tone arm. I don't know. This is the only model of this machine that I've ever seen. In fact, I think I wrote to the American Foundation for the Blind several years ago to see if they might happen to have a schematic diagram in their files, and I don't even think I got a reply from them, so, you know, but this will be a video for another day. But I just wanted to show you what the internal parts from this junker are going to help fix. They're going to get this old talking book player going. They're going to get this nice looking Hamilton School record player going, and they're going to get that Califone 1450 going, and it'll probably provide some parts for a few other things too. There's the speaker, a nice tube era speaker that will work nicely in that talking book player, and that's something that's getting harder to find. Yeah, I can find 5x7 speakers on eBay, but most of them are high-powered car speakers that are really not suited for low-powered little tube amplifiers that require a high-efficiency speaker in order to work their best. Alright, I went ahead and mounted the speaker inside of the talking book machine cabinet just so the speaker wouldn't get lost or damaged. And here's a peek at the inside of the talking book player. It uses a nice big 4-pole motor. Here's the amplifier that it was really butchered up when I got it. It's still kind of butchered up, but I'm going to go back through this and do it even neater. Just a 3-tube amp, a 12SJ7 wired as a triode, 50L6 output, and I believe a 50Y6 for a rectifier tube. But yeah, we're going to redo all this and make it look neater. And we'll probably have to mount our audio output transformer to the chassis here, which there'll be plenty enough room for that. And also the magnet structure on these newer speakers is so big that it would get in the way of the amplifier, which that wouldn't work. So yeah, even more reason for me to part out this crusty Califone just so I can get a vintage speaker with a smaller magnet structure that will allow clearance for the amplifier. Okay, and you can see what some dodo did on this Califone to compensate for the problem that it had. They just took the idler tension spring, removed it from this clip here, this post, stretched it out, and put it under this screw here. You know, they did that instead of actually taking the time to fix the problem, as in cleaning the mechanism and replacing the worn idler wheel. But that's okay, we'll just take the spring off of this other mechanism. Here's our other platter with a nice mat on it. And yes, I rotated it. It appears to be running pretty even. Okay, spring replaced, and the missing case screws replaced. And the platter swapped. And I just remembered I have a new comb buried down there that some clown bent all of this idler bracket and all of that mess up, screwed it up, so parts off of this will go on the new comb. So this junky Califone will see to it that at least 4 more record players live on, and there'll probably be parts off of this that'll go on other things, so probably figure at least 5 other items will live on because of parts from this beat up thing. Alright, I pretty much gutted this thing. We got to have us a good platter, except for needing a mat in case we run into a General Industries mechanism with a damaged platter. We have this old drive mechanism I'll keep for parts. And this little amplifier, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I might overhaul it and find something creative to do with it. It uses a 50L6, a 12AT6, and a last generation selenium rectifier. Of course, whatever I do with it, I'd probably want to couple it to an isolation transformer, you know, especially if this were modified for guitar use or something like that. I don't play guitar, but, you know, somebody who messes around with guitars might have a use for this. Here's some more hardware. The idler wheel, it don't appear to be in too good a shape, but maybe it's salvageable. And I'm saving the lid because every once in a while I've run into these older Califone players that were missing the lid, and you know, it would be nice to have one on hand in case I run up on such a machine in the future. And speaking of lids, I'll tell you a quick story that just goes to show that there are some entitled spoiled little brats among us. And I don't care if he's watching this, but somebody in the record player group, no, we're not Facebook friends, messaged me, and he needed a lid for one of the newer Califone players. I think it was a 1010 AV. Well, they made that record player from 1992 up until about 2005, but they made 2 or 3 different versions of it, and I know the cases were physically different sizes on at least 2 of the versions. And I want to say he needed a lid for the older version, and I had a newer version that I was parting out, and I told him at first, you're welcome to the lid if it'll fit on your player, but they made a couple of different versions. I need to know what version you have. Send me a picture of it. So he sent me a picture of it, and his was the early version. Mine was the late version, and I said, well, I don't think my lid will help you because I have the later version and you need the early version. And he wrote me back and said, well, can't you just measure it just to make sure? Well, I think I also had a early version here, and I tried the lid on my later one just to see, and it would not fit. Well, after I told him that it wouldn't fit, he asked me if I'd measure it anyway. And for whatever reason, I just got tied up with other things, and I didn't intentionally ignore him, but I just got tied up with other things, and it slipped my mind. Well, about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, I guess he got pissed because I didn't reply to him. He wrote me and told me in a sarcastic tone of voice, well, you won't have to worry about me bothering you again. And then he blocked me from sending him a message or looking at his Facebook page or anything like that. And I just laughed a little bit because, you know, number one, I told him that I didn't think that what I had would work. And number two, you know, I didn't intentionally ignore him, but you know how things go. Life gets in the way, and you know, this really wasn't real high on my priority list at the moment. But had he not acted like such a titty baby, I could have probably found him a lid, but once he blocked me, I just said, well, enough of him, and I could find 3 junk Califone record players with the lid he needed on them. They'd all probably either go in the garbage or they'd go in my pile. I certainly wouldn't try to track him down, but had he acted decent about it, I would have contacted him and said, hey, you still got that record player? I found you a lid that'll work. Where do I send it? But anyway, okay, we have the arm mounted to the Hamilton, and we have an 89T cartridge plugged in, actually the same one that was in the plastic arm that was on here. That was a DOLP tip, and one side was busted off. This is a real hot record, and really this is actually, that's really too much. That cartridge is really too hot for this amp, especially with these louder records. And it's kind of fatiguing to listen to, but usually on these Hamiltons like this, I change the cartridge out to a... But anyway, I changed the cartridge over to a Fan Steel P228 and adjust the tone arm to track at about 5 grams. Then I play with some of the input circuitry to the amplifier to make it sound more pleasing. And sure, these little cheap Hamilton record players are better when I get through with them than they are when they left the factory. And this one will certainly be better because it'll have a nice metal tone arm on it versus the little plastic cheapie that came on it. About the biggest thing this one has going for it is it has an AC drive mechanism and a metal turntable platter. But yeah, you go from tinny to even tinnier sounding. This doesn't have the nice, warm, bold sound that a Califone or a Newcomb or an Audiotronics or a VM has, because these amps just, in my opinion, were just not designed well. I don't know whether they were designed this way just to mainly for voice recordings or what, but we're going to play with this and try to get it sounding a bit better. I've also not cleaned and lubricated the mechanism, but I'll go ahead and do that shortly. And I see this uses those kind of motor mounts that like to get hard and crumble, so I'll replace them. Yeah, lots of old hard grease just slathered everywhere, so we got to clean all that up. Okay, with the help of some alcohol and paper towels and Q-tips, we got all that slathered on grease out of the way. And we'll just put a light coating of phono lube on these teeth here, on this step thing, and put some on this sprocket here, and that ought to be all that's necessary. Put a light coating of zoom spout oil on this shaft. But yeah, it's hard to believe that General Industries made this exact same mechanism for about 40 years. The only difference I see is the older ones used the 1490-01 wheel that had the larger diameter idler wheel shaft here, and then the later ones, well, starting in about 69 or 70, they switched to the smaller diameter idler wheel shaft that uses the 1407-03 wheel. I think that's the part number, but don't quote me on that. Alright, we took this apart, cleaned the shaft, cleaned the arm here, and put a few drops of oil on the shaft, and now it moves nice and freely. And we'll put a coating of oil on this shaft, put everything back together, and that will conclude this portion of the drive mechanism overhaul. Alright, that moves a lot freer than before. Now we need to get to the underside, take our spindle off, clean up the spindle and the bushing, and re-lubricate it with white lithium grease and a couple of drops of zoom spout mixed in with it. Alright, spindle's cleaned and lubricated and turning nice and smooth now. Now we need to do is just clean up this excess here. And now we're ready to take the motor out and clean and lubricate it. And you can see this this motor is date coded 9606, which stands for the 6th week of 1996. And this record player has a final assembly date of October the 11th, 1996. And as you can see, this is one of those motors with a secondary winding to provide low voltage for the amplifier. And we have the motor out, and you can see these motor mounts, they're still pliable, but they're starting to turn brown, and that's what they do when they're starting to deteriorate. And I'm not going to throw these away because I might use these in some trashy resurrection project where the original mounts have literally turned to powder, but these need to be replaced. And there's the new motor mounts in place. I get these from Antique Electronics Supply. As you can see, they're cone-shaped mounting grommets, and I'm a little ticked at myself because I just placed an order with them the other day and forgot all about ordering some of these, and I've only got enough left to do one more record player, so I guess I'll be placing another order with them real soon. Alright, I cleaned out the bottom bushing with Q-tips and alcohol and cleaned the shaft here. This shaft looks to be in pretty good shape, not well worn like some of them are, but seeing as how this is from 1996, I don't imagine it was used much since records were pretty much out by then. This thing probably spent more time on a shelf than it did actually in use, and I know the church I attended up until about 2009, they still had a bunch of these little Hamilton record players in the children's daycare area and in some of the children's Sunday school rooms, but I don't think they ever used them that much anymore. And I've actually found several of these locally around, so I can't help but wonder if maybe that's where they came from. Alright, we're going to saturate this wick on both the top and bottom bushing with zoom spout oil, and then we'll put some zoom spout directly down into the bushing itself. Alright, motor's back end, everything hand tightened, and we'll wrap on the motor sides with the butt end of a screwdriver as we tighten it down and make sure the shaft turns extremely freely. We don't need any binding here. Okay, now would be a good time to wash your hands to get all of any lubricant off of them, and then we will, with the motor running, we'll wet a paper towel and alcohol and clean this shaft thoroughly of any lubricant that's most surely going to be on it after we just oiled it, because we don't want to get any lubricant on the idler wheel surface, the motor shaft itself, or the inner rim of the turntable platter. Even the slightest amount will cause improper operation. Alright, clean the idler wheel. You can use rubber renew or fine grade sandpaper or rubbing alcohol or anything like that. This wheel is relatively new in the grand scheme of things, so it really is in good shape still. And I put a very light bit of phono lube on the idler wheel shaft, and it spins freely and quietly now. So now all we need to do is clean the inner rim of the turntable platter with alcohol, put it all back together, and the mechanics of this thing should be good to go for another 25 or 35 or 40 years or more. Alright, platter's back on, we're in neutral. It spins very freely and quietly, and it's not horribly off balance, so that's good. 45, 78, 33, and 16. And it's got lots of torque, even on 16, so this one's ready to go.
Found out, he began to shout.
Wonder if copyright ID will catch that at 78 RPM. It's 5 p.m. and dark is about to catch us, so we got through just in time. Now all we have to do is address the amplifier and cartridge issues and do a little cosmetic detailing on this, mainly cleaning and gluing down this covering that's starting to come loose here, and then we'll have a nice little record player when we're done. Oh yeah, and one other thing about these, when you're not using them, you want to remember to put the speed lever in neutral to prevent the idler wheel from getting dented. These cheaper record players don't have a idler retract mechanism when you turn the unit off, like the Caliphones and Newcombs and some of the Audiotronics models have. So yeah, you want to remember that. Because you get a dent in your idler wheel and you're looking at about $35 for a replacement. You can't run down to the parts house and get one for $5.95 anymore. Okay, I dug around in my junk and found a Barco cartridge that was in a record changer. This looks like one from the 90s, and actually it's a bit better made than the ones we get today. And I found some connectors and some jumpers in my stash and wired the cartridge for mono. Right plus and left plus connected together, and then right minus and left minus connected together. And I adjusted the tension spring on the tone arm to get the tracking a little bit lighter. The needle in it's about shot. It's a dual LP needle, and the one side is about gone, so I have it flipped over to the other side. I'll dig around here and try to find a LP78 flip needle. If I can't find one, I'll order one, but we still need to do the amplifier. It's not as loud as it was. Looks like the tonal quality is a little bit better. We don't really need to get it much louder, but the 89T that was in there was really too hot for this. Okay, we have a couple of components shunted across the cartridge input to the amplifier. A 100k ohm resistor and this disc capacitor that I believe is a 0.01 microfarad. I usually up this 100k ohm resistor to about a 680k and get rid of this capacitor, and we'll see what it sounds like. And then we'll just tweak our values until we get something I'm happy with. And then I'm also going to look at this tone control and see what value capacitor is connected to it. And we may up that value a little bit just to give us a little bit better treble cut. Actually, I misspoke earlier. This is a 0.0022 microfarad cap, not a 0.01, which I believe I said it was. Anyway, I removed that and up the input resistor, shunt resistor, to a 680k, and that seems to improve our volume to a acceptable level. I don't really think we need to get any louder, because if we do, it's just going to distort, and that will not be any good anyway.
Your answer, your name, your complete mailing address, and your phone number, and you could be this week's winner of $100 worth of groceries from the Piggly Wiggly of Collinsville and Stonewall. Today's clue is, Abraham believed God to obtain this virtue. What is that virtue? Again, the clue is, Abraham believed God to obtain this virtue. We're wanting to know what that virtue is. Well, if you think you know what the answer is, call the WMER recorded line at 601-693-1390. Again, 601-693-1390. Give us your answer, your name.
Yeah, I have my clip leads and attached to the audio input of this amplifier, just experimenting with capacitor values, and we see how easy it is to pick up 1390 overmodulated WMER. Okay, I played with some component values on the input circuitry until I found a combination that I'm happy with, where it's not quite so shrill sounding. The tone circuit in this thing is kind of weird, and I played around with those capacitors and didn't really much change for the better. So I played around with the input components, and I'll show you what I did here. Okay, here's our EQ circuit between the cartridge and the amplifier input. We have R1 and C1 that are connected in parallel across the pickup cartridge. And of course the low side of that goes to circuit ground, and the high side goes through this other network here, which comprises C2 and R2 in parallel, and then the output of that network goes to the hot side of the amplifier input. Now from the factory, R1 was 100k ohm and C1 was a 0.002 microfarad, and then C2 was a 470 picofarad, and R2 was a 470k ohm resistor. Well, after I played with everything, R1 went from a 100k to a 680k ohm. I put C1 back in the circuit, the 0.002 microfarad that was from the factory. We eliminated C2, the 470 picofarad, and we lowered the 470k ohm resistor down to 82k ohms. Now our tone control has a little effect, just like it did before, but it's not quite so shrill sounding now, and it's more suitable for music than it was to start with, so I think we're about ready to button this thing up and call it a day. And while I was in here, I ESR tested all of the capacitors. There was only 4 of them, and the only one that checked a bit high was this 4.7 microfarad cap here, so I replaced that. These other capacitors checked perfectly fine, and I'm not going to change them. You know, these capacitors may not seem very expensive when you're buying them one piece at a time, but when you're buying 10 or 15 at a time and buying many values, that adds up. And if I go changing capacitors willy-nilly and stuff, my supply is going to run out quick, and that means I'm going to be back to spending big bucks with Mouser Electronics ordering new capacitors for my stash, and I really don't want to do that. So we're going to save the capacitors on hand to replace ones that really need to be replaced, not ones that still check good. And this is not some high-stress application, so they'll probably remain good for quite some time. A whopping 12.5 grams. Apparently I didn't play with that counterbalance spring enough. It may go from not only having to bend the tab to reposition it, I may have to remove links from the spring in order to get it down to about 6 grams. Alright, I have the spring loose. I've already removed several links. This is a trial and error process, and it's also a royal pain in the butt trying to get the spring off, get it bent around properly, and get it back on there, and then measuring it again and seeing that you haven't taken enough off. And like I said, it's just a pain in the butt, and I'm about to the point that whatever it measures next time is how it can stay. I mean, this is not some critical listening station that you're going to use for your Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab records. This is something you're going to use for your old beat-up crap, so what if it tracks at 9 grams? Alright, after much playing with it, I got it down to 7.5 grams, and that's where it's staying. I'm tired of fooling with it. That's better than 12, and like I said, this is not something for playing your prized vinyl on anyway. Technically, this type of arm was really not meant to be adjusted. It was meant for one particular cartridge, and that was that. Now, the newer box-style arm that has the little hooks in it, those can be adjusted, but that type of arm was too long for this record player, so, you know, it is what it is. Alright, there we go. Alright, get that off of there. We don't want to trigger any copyright, please. Here we are with an LP. And that 78 sounds surprisingly well, seeing as how I'm playing it with an LP needle. But this is a later 78, and I think some of those had more narrow grooves than the earlier ones did. I'm still thinking this thing is a little bit too shrill and hot, so I may have to go back in it and bump up the value of that capacitor that's across the cartridge and see what that does. Okay, I went back in and upped the value of that capacitor that's in parallel with the cartridge from a .0022 to a .0033. That sounds a little more pleasing now. And really, that's just a personal preference, whatever you like. Me personally, I don't like shrill-sounding, loud record players. I would rather some of the high-end be cut off of that. And of course, that will also not make worn, scratchy records as prominent. And on that note, let's talk about vinyl and styrene. This is a 45 RPM pressed on vinyl. A vinyl record is usually flexible, as you can see, and the labels are usually painted on, and if you hold one up to a bright light, you won't be able to see through it. This 45 here is made out of a material called polystyrene, or styrene for short. Usually, those types of records have paper labels that are glued on. The records are more rigid than a vinyl pressing. They're more breakable. In fact, they're almost as breakable as a 78. And they're more squared off on the edges here. And usually when you hold one up to a bright light, you can see light pass through the record. Now, in my mind, whatever whoever came up with Styrene, and that was Columbia Records, by the way, they ought to have been taken behind the barn and beaten to death. Well, not literally, but you know what I mean. Styrene was something that Columbia come out with in the early 50s to, number one, because it was cheaper, and number two, they wanted to make RCA's 45 RPM records seem inferior to their to Columbia's long-playing 33 1/3 RPM format. And in most cases, Columbia pressed all of their 45's. Well, I say all, there were some exceptions, but probably 3/4 of the Columbia and Epic 45 RPM records that you find from about 1953 on up to about 1990 or 91 are going to be pressed on this crappy Styrene. I think it was sometime in the early 90s when pretty much everybody moved away from Styrene, but by that time the heyday of the 45 was about over with. The only reason they were being pressed up into the 90s and later was for jukebox use. Now, one advantage to Styrene records, if you get a pressing that's in mint condition, and if it was pressed right to begin with, they'll sound very good. Oftentimes they're quieter than a vinyl pressing, but the main disadvantage to Styrene is they are very unforgiving when it comes to heavy tracking tone arms or needles that are not quite up to par or tracking angles that are incorrect or any such number of things. And when I tried to play this 45 on this record player here, I don't know if you can see it, but the first half of the record you can tell where the needle plowed through the record grooves there. And that's the reason why so many of these Styrene 45s that we find out in the wild today are in poor shape, and even if they look good, you play them and they sound like crap because they were oftentimes played on cheap equipment that tracked heavy and used an inferior cartridge and needle. The only way such a record can stand a chance for longevity is if you play it on a decent component turntable with a lightweight tracking tone arm and magnetic cartridge, and even at that, it's still iffy because even radio stations found out that their Styrene records were wearing out very fast on their professional grade turntables, and that's why many radio stations transferred their records to carts and then played the magnetic tape card on the air instead of wearing the record out, and then when the cart became damaged or worn out or whatever, they could just simply dub another copy. Now, vinyl, on the other hand, is way more forgiving of such thing as heavier tracking tone arms and those other things I mentioned. In fact, playing this record on this record player, I didn't notice any groove color change. But as you saw, that wasn't the case for the Styrene record. Now, the recommended tracking force of this cartridge is 5 to 8 grams, and it's been my experience that these cartridges seem to not do as much damage to Styrene, at least not visibly if you can track them at around 5 grams. When you get up to 7 or 8 grams, they start being destructive. But I've already mentioned to you that this spring is a major pain in the butt to deal with, and I don't know that I want to risk taking the spring back off and removing more links and possibly taking too much off and having the tone arm track too light, and then I'll have to come up with another spring or add some kind of weight under the tone arm, and I really don't want to do that, so I don't know what we're going to do. Pretty much my rule with these types of record players is not to play any Styrene records on them, or at least ones that I care to keep in good shape. If it's something that's already trashed, well, so what? And for that matter, I really don't play anything on something like this that I want to preserve for a long time. But fortunately, there's enough cheap records at thrift stores that have already been through heck and back, and you know, you can play those on something like this without really fear of ruining anything good. If you gouge it even more, so what? It was already worn out to begin with. Now on this Styrene record, I played about a quarter of the way through, and I'm not noticing any groove damage, but I also know from what I'm told, there's different degrees of styrene cheapness. And it seems like Columbia and Epic and Bell Records were the two biggest offenders of using the absolute cheapest material possible to press their 45's, even though this is an older Columbia record. The one that we just chewed up was from 1988, and by that time the 45 heyday was nearing a close, and they probably weren't going to much expense to press them by then. Alright, I played with the spring some more and got it down to 5.6. That's a lot better, and that's probably where we're going to leave it. However, when I have the tone arm positioned up about where it would be on the turntable platter, it's up to 7.7 grams, so I guess the spring's going to have to be played with some more. Okay, we're at 6.1, and that's probably where it's going to stay. I'm not going to keep pushing my luck here. Alright, it's still cutting into this record, and besides changing the needle, that's about all I know to do to it. I mean, it is what it is. It's not a high-end record player like I've already said about 10 times. This is good for playing your beat-up junk, not the stuff you want to preserve. Alright, I found a new needle in my stash. I thought I had an LP 78 flip variety, but I don't. This is a dual LP, and that's the way it's going to stay. When this thing goes to a new home, if somebody wants to play 78s, they can order a 78 needle. It's Fan Steel 865 DS 73. Now we're going to try the other side of this Rodney Crowell record and see if it cream puffs it like it did with the other needle. Stop this and let it play a minute or two. And, well, it doesn't appear to be as bad as the other one, but whenever I hold it up at an angle, I can definitely tell that the played portion looks different than the unplayed portion. So that's just it is what it is. There's not a lot more I can do about this. Here's an LP. Wish that LP was in better shape, but like I said, the record in this condition is perfect for playing on vintage old record players such as this one. Yeah, I thought we'd throw in some Donny Osmond. Every record player video needs at least some Donny Osmond playing. And one of the 16 RPM Seaberg background music records. I tried to center it on here as best I could. But yeah, it sounds pretty good now after my little modifications that I made. It'll never be a Newcomb or an Audiotronics or a Califone, but it's still not a bad little record player.
By Niomash. Copyright 1966 by Niomash Limited. Recorded for the Library of Congress in the Talking Book Studios of American Foundation for the Blind Incorporated, with the kind permission of the publishers Little, Brown and Company. Solely for the use of the blind. Read by Peter Gerald. Listeners are requested to keep these talking book discs clean and in order. About the author. Nio, spelt N-G-A.
Okay, a little bit of follow-up on here. After doing some more testing, I could detect motor vibration being transferred to the motor board here. And one thing I've had a problem in the past, not often, but sometimes, these newer grommets you get from Antique Electronics Supply, they're a bit too stiff, and the result is motor vibration gets transferred. So I carefully examined the old grommets that came out of here, and they still appear to be pliable, which means they've got should have a lot of life left in them. So I reinstalled them, and now it's quiet, and we have very little vibration being transferred. And I also think I got rid of the styrene torture, or at least a good bit of it anyway. I remembered I had a, for all intents and purposes, new cartridge with an LP 78 flip needle and another record player that I had never completed. So I robbed that cartridge out of that record player and put it in this one. However, I discovered that there's a problem with the LP 78 flip needle due to poor quality control. So I had to put the dual LP needle in this cartridge that's now installed in the record player, and I'll now show you what I'm talking about. In the 78 position, the needle is seated like it should be. However, when I flip it over to the 45 to the LP position, you see it pops up there and doesn't seat properly. And as you can tell, the cantilever is not making proper contact with the yoke like it should be. But when I flip it back to 78, hang on a second, it seats properly and makes contact with the yoke. So that's just poor quality control in the manufacture of that needle, and it's the same way in the other cartridge. So it's not the cartridge, it's the needle. And this is what we run into a lot with these newer cartridges and needles. The ones I've gotten, for the most part, always worked as far as had output like they were supposed to, but the quality control often leaves a lot to be desired, such as loose pins on the back of the cartridge, pins that are not formed properly, and it's hard to slide the connectors over the pins. The clip that holds the needle in place will often be loose, and the needle won't stay firmly seated in the cartridge. I've had some of the P51 cartridges that have a set screw mount needle, where if you loosen the screw to replace the needle, the threads strip out, and when you try to tighten the screw back down for the new needle, it won't stay tight. So, but yet they don't think a thing about charging $20, $25 a piece for some of those cartridges. So yeah, go figure. That's why I always buy my cartridges and needles from reputable vendors, and that way if there's a problem, they'll take care of it. Now, the bad needle in this cartridge, that was so long ago, and I'm just now catching it. There's no way I would go back on anybody at this time about it. It is what it is. I'll just save this cartridge for something else and order a new needle for it. Now, the Voice of Music website sells several different types of motor mounting grommets, and I may need to just start ordering from him. I know he sells one specific for the General Industries mechanism and one for the Alliance mechanism, and these I've been ordering from Antique Electronics Supply. I've been using in both types of mechanisms and usually haven't had any trouble, but like I said, occasionally you get one where the motor is a little bit too noisy, and well, I really won't say noisy, it's just the vibrations of the motor sometimes will transfer to the motor board because these grommets are just a bit too stiff. Alright, there you go. I think we're done with this now, and with that said, hope you got something out of all this, and more to come later. Alright, one last thing, and I hope this is it. We had one little issue here, whereas when I grab the metal tone arm to raise it or pick it up off the record, you hear a slight buzz in the speaker, and you may ask, why did that happen? Because this metal body of the tone arm is electrically isolated by these rubber grommets here from anything else. I could take my ohm meter and connect it between this tone arm body and the metal motor board here, and there would be an open circuit. So you're probably asking, well, why does it hum whenever you grab the tone arm? Well, there's just enough stray capacitance between this tone arm body and the rest of the tone arm base here, which attaches to the motor board, to provide just enough signal path for to cause hum whenever you touch the body of the tone arm. So we solved that problem by soldering a piece of phono lead to this tab here where the counterbalance spring attaches, and running it down through here, and soldering the other end of the wire to circuit ground. So now I can touch the tone arm and there's no static, there's no buzz, there's no popping, and we're good to go.
Who is that? Listening Styrene was a while before she could talk.
Alright, as far as I'm concerned, this thing is ready to go, and I'm tired of fooling with it, so there you have it.